Some of you have called Testify the Bart Ehrman response channel. Listen, mister, I don't know what you're talking about. I respond to a lot of other... Okay, you're probably not wrong. Maybe I should start charging Ehrman rent because he clearly lives in my head. I know a lot of Christians question Ehrman's motives. I honestly just think that he does a very good job expressing the negative verdict against the Gospels really well, and he gives me a lot of opportunity to present another perspective. Anyway, Alex O'Connor, aka the artist formerly known as Cosmic Skeptic, aka the budding future Christian apologist who just hasn't realized it yet, sat down with Ehrman for an interview about the resurrection, Jesus, his own self-claims, and there's a lot worth responding to in this particular interview. But today I'm just going to respond to one particular claim. Alex asked,
do you think there's any instances in any of the gospel narratives where writers are purposefully inventing events or sayings to serve a theological purpose?
To which Bart responded,
yeah, I think there are. I think there's some places where you can identify it.
So what fabrications in the Gospels does Ehrman have in mind?
And I think there are a lot of places where they're just, you just can't know. If Matthew has a story that's only in Matthew, there's technically no way to know whether he just came up with that himself. And there's a lot of that kind of thing where you can't know.
Okay, let's pause here for just 1 second. Perhaps in the future, I'll do an entire video on this topic, but there's this idea in biblical scholarship that we need multiple sources in order for a story to be considered more trustworthy. Sure, multiple attestation is a nice thing to have, but this approach of evaluating the Gospels passage by passage is flawed for several reasons. For starters, it requires us to fake amnesia over what we've already confirmed in other sources, which doesn't make sense. If we have good reasons to believe that a passage is historical, shouldn't that influence our evaluation of other passages in the same document? With this method, even if we find many passages or stories in a gospel that meet multiple attestation or some other criteria, we still have to approach the new passages as if we have no idea about the reliability of the document. We must ask once again if the next passage satisfies the so-called criteria of authenticity. However, good historical methodology involves using all available evidence, including past confirmations of a document or author. If an author or document has been consistently honest and reliable, we should adjust our estimation of their reliability accordingly. And for what comes next, we're not talking about anything miraculous, but something rather mundane. Let's let Ehrman continue.
There are places where it's pretty clear somebody's just coming up with something. It's not clear if it's necessarily the author, but somebody's clearly coming up with something. The idea in Matthew, here's an example. In Matthew explains why Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he came from Nazareth. And he says that the reason they moved to Nazareth was to fulfill the scriptures that says, he shall be called a Nazarene.
Yes.
But the problem... This is part of Matthew's whole thing where Matthew's always saying Jesus did this to fulfill what the prophet said. He's going to be born in Bethlehem, going to be born of a virgin, he's going to be called a Nazarene. Well, the other times when he says that, you can actually find the verse he's talking about, and you might be misinterpreting it, but at least you know what the verse is. There's no verse in the Bible that says he shall be called a Nazarene.
And let's just restate that for our listeners, because Matthew continually throughout the gospel is saying that, and this occurred to fulfill the prophecy, to fulfill the scripture. And you look in the Old Testament and you find, oh, there's the scripture, and he's sort of got this story that fulfills the scripture. Here, the idea that Jesus comes from Nazareth is to fulfill the scripture that says that he shall be called a Nazarene.
Yeah.
And we look for that line.
It's not there.
And it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, there are a lot of theories about it, and it doesn't look like probably Matthew's just like lying about it. Probably there are lots of explanations. The most popular explanation is that he's referring to allegedly messianic prophecy in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1, we're told that David will have a successor who will succeed him on the throne, and that he'll come from the Nazar of David, the root of David. So it's like a tree metaphor, like the tree has roots, and so the root will grow into a tree, and one of the fruits of the tree will be this Messiah. And so he comes from the root of David. And the word for root in Hebrew is Nazar, and it sounds like Nazarene. And so it may be that he has that in mind, for example.
But if that is the case,
yeah,
We're essentially talking about like a mistranslation.
Yeah, it's a mistranslation. It's a misunderstanding. It's somebody made it up. I mean, Matthew may have made it up. Somebody made it up.
Okay, so what's going on here? Is Matthew just being a bozo and mistranslating things here? We all know that Matthew, more than any other gospel writer, is trying to connect Jesus' life to the Hebrew Bible, as Ehrman rightly points out. But when Matthew mentions a specific prophecy, he usually mentions the prophet who said it. However, if he's talking about multiple events in Jesus' life, he refers to the scriptures or the prophets being fulfilled. Matthew also often includes the word saying after quoting a prophecy, suggesting that it's a direct quote from the Hebrew Bible. But in Matthew 2:23, he says that Jesus is being called a Nazarene fulfills what the prophets said. It's important to note that there was no quotation marks in the original text, so it doesn't necessarily mean a direct citation. From this pattern, I'd argue that Matthew wasn't referring to one specific prophecy. He mentions the prophets and doesn't use the word saying. Instead, he has a theme or a common thread in mind that runs through several prophetic books. So what exactly was Matthew thinking of? Considering that Matthew carefully thought about and reflected on the Hebrew Bible, and he had a clear understanding of the Hebrew text as we see from reading other passages, we can look for two things: a play on words that caught his attention and a related messianic theme. And what we find is that both of these elements are present. In Matthew 1:23, he refers to Isaiah 7:14, and in Matthew 4:12 through 16, he refers to Isaiah 9:1 through 2. These chapters are part of an important messianic section in the book of Isaiah, which includes the major messianic prophecy in Isaiah 11:1, starting with the words, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit." The Hebrew word used for branch here is netzer, which is closely related to the word Nazareth, as Ehrman mentions in the interview. However, I think that Bart is downplaying its significance. It's actually relevant for several reasons. It shows us that Matthew had the entire messianic section of Isaiah 7 through 11 in mind when he quoted prophecies about Jesus' birth and early life. It also connects with the word Nazareth itself. Additionally, it aligns with the concept of the Messiah being called the branch in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, and it reflects the humble origins of the Messiah as seen in Isaiah 11:1 and the lowly reputation of Nazareth. Remember that Nazareth had a negative reputation and was considered a place of low status. This can be seen in Nathanael's reaction when he questioned, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" In this context, the term Nazarene carried a derogatory connotation, fitting for the Messiah, whom the prophets had foretold would be despised and rejected by men. So rather than thinking that this is a mistranslation, this indeed could be a play on words, referring back to Isaiah 9:1 and Isaiah 11:1. People use wordplay all the time. It's just a normal human thing to do. Now today, Christians wouldn't use this as evidence that the Old Testament predicted that Jesus would grow up in Nazareth. I totally get that. I'm not entirely sure that Matthew was intending for himself to be understood that way either. Matthew wrote his gospel for Jewish Christians who, if you know your history, were also known as Nazarenes. Matthew was happy to find a connection between the Old Testament and the name Netzer, which is referred to the Messiah using Jewish methods of interpretation. It's interesting to note that in a similar manner, there is a legendary list of 5 disciples of Jesus mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud. In Sanhedrin 43a, one of these disciples is named Netzer, and they use Isaiah 11:1 as an argument in its favor. Just take a look.
Our rabbis have taught us Jesus had 5 disciples, Mattai, Nakai, Netzer, and Buni, and Toda. Then they brought Netzer in to stand trial. He said to the judges, "Shall Netzer be executed? But isn't it written, 'And a Netzer, meaning branch, shall grow out of his roots'?" They said to him, "Yes, Netzer shall be executed as it is written, but you are cast out of your grave like an abhorred Netzer."
Therefore, rather than this showing us that Matthew was making things up, it shows Matthew's Jewish background, insight, and use of wordplay. This is a Jewish thing that's happening with Matthew here that has some precedent in the Old Testament. Finally, it's interesting to note that Ezra 9:10 through 12 provides an interesting parallel to Matthew 2:23. When Ezra was praying and repenting, he claimed to quote the Lord's words spoken through the prophets, even though those exact words are not found in the prophetic books. Ezra was summarizing and paraphrasing the consistent message of God's prophets, just as Matthew did. Ezra or Matthew weren't quoting from lost prophetic books. Both were simply restating the consistent message of the prophets in their own words. You don't need to be a fundamentalist or an inerrantist to say that Matthew didn't really make a mistake here. There's just not a good reason to think that Matthew made a major flub. Now, Ehrman goes on to talk about how the virgin birth is based on a mistranslation of Isaiah 7:14 and how Matthew just completely rips that passage out of context to make it say something that it doesn't say at all. I talk about that in another video, which you'll see at the end screen here. So go ahead and check that out, and I'll see you there. And I may do some more responses to this particular podcast in the future. So definitely stay tuned, and thank you so much for watching.